Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, April 20th, and a special board meeting is being called to order. I want to welcome our budget committee members who are joining us today. This is a board meeting, not a budget committee meeting, but since this meeting is centered on learning about the budget process, we have invited budget committee members to participate. At the moment, I do want to say we do not have a full quorum at the moment, but we are expecting one more board member to join us. So at the moment, it will become a district meeting. And currently we have Director Marty Hyen and Director Maria Nojos Presi and myself, Osvaldo. We will turn this over to the district in a second after introduce our budget committee members that are online. We have Laura Million, Nancy McMorris Addis, Levi Herrera Lopez, and Lisa Harnish. I believe we have, I'm trying to go through here, we have Barbara Gil, and do we have Oni? If not, I'll turn it over to our superintendent, Christy Perry, to facilitate the meeting.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with some answers to questions, and then I'll turn it over to our Chief Operations Officer, Bob Silva, to talk about some of our funding that we have outside of the Gen Fund. So if I could get you, though, to get on the district website and get to the adopted budget book like you have done in the past, that would be great. And I've got to make sure I've got my screen share up here. Let's see. All right, so you're going to go to that adopted budget page again. And if you'll go to the second, not the supplemental budget, but the adopted budget. And while you're finding that, I'll tell you a funny story. I was working on my budget questions today and I accidentally hit the reader. And there's nothing like having the budget book read to you as a superintendent by the reader. That was, most people would fall asleep. I was very excited about that. Okay, so I'm going to weave in a lot of your questions, but I'm going to answer them through the lens of the budget book. And some of the questions were forward thinking questions, like there's a question on how much are we expecting PERS to cost? I'll show you where PERS was budgeted last year. And then when we get to the budget message in a couple of weeks, I'll bring those questions back in at this time. So there were a few questions. If you'll go to page 25, and I have it up on the screen there. If you'll go to page 25 in your budget book, there was a question about union contracts and health insurance and some of those things. So first of all, when we adopted the budget last year, we were in the middle of bargaining with both of our employee groups. So the fifth bullet down says salary and medical insurance calculations were based on our known rates because we were in collective bargaining for at the time. So since that time, we are in a 2-year contract with both associations this year, the current school year, and next year. We are in those contracts. So when we did the supplemental budget, which if you went to the website, that one that was at the top, we wove in those costs based on those negotiated settlements with our employee groups. And then this is how we budgeted for PERS this year. The next line down, you can see I've done it in both. I've tried to highlight these for you so that you can see exactly how we budgeted. When I come forward with the budget message on May 3rd, you'll get a budget book and it'll have a page just like this in it, which is our assumptions. Because also down third from the bottom, and I was visiting with our director of finance a little bit this morning and asking why we did this. But last year we said materials and services were not adjusted for inflation. And a lot of times we'll have an inflation amount. And what we've seen with inflation in the last probably 4 to 6 weeks, I don't know that we've in the projected budget, we'll have budgeted enough for that because it's really escalated since we've done that. But I'll share all that with you when we get to the budget process of how we're building next year's budget. The other question came up about health insurance, and would our health insurance rates go down at all as our employee groups were getting younger? So schools are part of OEBB, Oregon Educator Benefits Board, and we have a rate based on every educator in Oregon. So the Salem-Keizer rates are based, are just one, or Salem-Keizer employees are just one part. We budget a cap for our employees, so we don't pay the entire cost of health insurance for our employees. We cap out at a monthly amount for our employees. And so I don't see, based on what I see with health insurance, I don't see any reduction in those costs for us. In fact, I would project those costs are going to escalate. On the subject of bargaining, next year, we have settled contracts, but we will begin bargaining for the following school year with both our classified and our licensed associations. So both contracts will be open for full bargaining, and we'll begin that next year for the following year, which is where it will impact the budget. So,
Christine,
yes, go ahead.
just to interrupt real quick and just state that we do have a full quorum with Director Chantiguri joining us online.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so if you would now scroll to page 99. So I'm going to scroll fast, but if you'll scroll in your book, because I want you to be able to see where these things are budgeted in your book. And for next year's budget, it'll all be there in the same way. So if you could scroll to page 99, which takes a little bit online, and why I like a paper version.
You can click on top of the number, so I put 99 and it jumps right to it too. It says 99 off 226.
Thank you. I was trying to do that before we got on and it did not work very well for me. So thank you, Barbara. Okay, so on page 99, if you look at what I have highlighted, 210 public employees retirement system, you can see at the very far right, 83 million, it was this budget for this year, what we budgeted for PERS. If you'll look the year before, we had a smaller amount. So we budgeted less because we are, as we have a younger group and the PERS costs are different. If you go back to that assumptions page, it tells you exactly what the costs are for each employee group and what percentage of payroll. The other item, 240 on employee insurance. This is where we budget our health insurance. So that's a budgeted cost based on what we're projecting per employee for health insurance. And then the final question that came up that I want to point to in the budget book was around operating contingency. We do always have an operating contingency. It's funded in Object 810 here on page 101. And last year, our budgeted operating contingency was at 36 million. So the last thing, and some of these other questions were not as much budget questions, so I'll try to put these into an email so you can see them, and this document as well. There was a document or a question asking about our overall SSAA strategies, and I'll send this to you so you don't have to take down numbers. But in this school year, this isn't what we're doing for next year, but in this school year, this is the amount we spent per strategy. So our social emotional learning strategy is at about 22% of all of the SIA, extracurricular activities, engagement in healthy things, 13%. So you can see kind of percentage wise how we have projected costs for our strategies. And again, we'll have the same strategies for next year. Next year is our community engagement time if we're going to switch any strategies, but next year we'll have the same strategies, but our percentages will shift slightly. And somewhere in the budget process, I'll show you next year's thing. The last item I just want to say is someone asked, can restorative practices be paid for out of ESSER? The answer is yes. As far as training for our teachers, yes, and it is paid for. And I'll finish these up and I'll stop screen sharing so you can start your screen share, Bob. So yes, it is. there was another question around, was there only transition programs at 3 high schools? The answer is no. Every high school has a 9th grade transition program. It's an example of how we braid funds. Dr. Udos Natal was talking about, I think, Measure 98 or high school success at that time. So we braid funds, so every school has that program. And then the names of who oversees the summer programs from the executive level, it's Dr. West. But when I email you, I'll provide you the other couple names of who's overseeing. We have multiple people overseeing our summer programs. All right.
You muted, Christy.
Oh, sorry. I was so quickly turning it over to Bob, I muted myself. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Operations Officer, Bob Silva.
Okay, thank you and welcome, everyone. Before I continue, I just want to check in with Osvaldo one more time. Do we need to call it to order now that we do have quorum? I don't know how we want to handle that.
It's a great idea.
Oh, yes. This meeting has been called to order with the school board meeting with a full quorum. And I want to see if Director Carson Cunningham has joined us as well. She has. So we've, with the addition of Vice Chair Ashley Carson Cunningham and again, Director Chandagiri, 5 board members are in attendance.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So today, hopefully I can do as good a job as Ethan and Olga did last week, but don't hold your hopes up. Don't have that teaching background that they do, but we're going to discuss some of the special funds outside of the general fund, and in your book that's tagged as, or I guess if you're looking at the PDF, the special revenue funds in 200. And as we get into these, one of the things that I want to talk about is our transportation facility, because that's going to be, since it's still in construction, you're still going to see a lot of budget numbers surrounding the transportation facility. And if you're not familiar with what the new transportation facility is, I included some pictures here for you. So it's out on Gaffin Road. It's expected to be complete in July. In our new budget, we'll cover some expenses that we expect to see in association with firing up a new transportation facility within the school district. So back in April of 2020, the Salem-Keizer board did approve a full faith and credit obligation bond to go out of $60.3 million. And that started the construction of a transportation facility on the Gaffin Road and accounts for the replacement of about 200 school buses. So that replacement cycle will occur over the span of several years, and much like everything else during the pandemic, supply chain issues also impact school bus availability. So we're trying to stay on our original schedule of bus replacement, but it is being impacted. When the budget message is presented here in a couple weeks, there will be a transportation package on there. So once the facility is open in July of this year, it'll need to be staffed. We'll need supplies for it. So there'll be an ad package to basically maintain equivalent service levels at both our Gaffin Road new facility and our existing Hawthorne transportation facility. So that's dispatchers, routers, mechanics, lube technicians, office staff, office supplies. So there's just a lot of expenses involved with firing up a new facility, and that will be in this year's budget. Specific to transportation, I want to call out that a lot of the majority of transportation expenses are 70% reimbursable through ODE. And that's for operating expenses such as salaries and supplies, whereas capital assets such as the facility itself and our buses are reimbursed through depreciation. So for like buses that have a 10-year depreciation cycle, we'll get 70% of that depreciation reimbursed for the next 10 years. For the facility itself, that depreciation occurs over the next 25 years. And again, 70% of that depreciation is reimbursed to the school district. All right, asset replacement, you can find that on page 128. It is Fund 222 in your budget book. So the asset replacement, as we go through these funds, we're going to kind of discuss how the money goes in to the budget, and then why, or into the fund, or and why the fund exists or how we use it. So our asset replacement fund 222 is funded with transfers from the general fund, as well as the bus depreciation payments that we just spoke about. Asset replacement fund essentially acts as a savings account for the school district. So a good example of that is with the American Rescue Plan that was recently passed in March of 2021. That fully funded the replacement of all of our Chromebook devices. And that bill will come due again in 5 years. And it's not something that we could typically fund within our general fund budget during a single school year. So what that requires a school district to do through the asset replacement fund is to start saving up for that future purchase, if that makes sense for everybody. This applies to curriculum, furniture, playground structures, musical instruments, and buses and vehicles. So this year, what we really want to focus on is using an equity lens on a lot of our district assets, such as playground structures. Musical instruments is another area where variances within our community cause variances within our schools as far as the quality or access to certain things like upgraded playground structures, newer instruments, etc. So we're really hoping to apply an equity lens onto the sustaining some of these assets that we have across the district. Next in your book is Fund 418. So that's a different section that goes down to our capital project funds. On page 178, you'll see Fund 418. And this is funded mainly by reimbursements from our Oregon Facilities Grant, transfers from the Energy Efficiency Fund, which all have to do with our construction activities. And they get put into this Fund 418. And for the most part, as an example of how we've used this fund in the past, when the school district had to convert to all-day kindergarten, for instance, we had to buy a lot of modulars to put out there and make facilities modifications. That was funded out of 418. An example of how this will be used in the future is pre-bond planning work. So there's a lot of expenses that go into preparing for a bond project. So Fund 418 kind of provides the revenue needed to tackle some of those kind of special, unexpected, or long-range type planning issues. Right after 418, on page 118, we have 419. This is our preventative and deferred maintenance fund. These are funded annually with a transfer from the general fund. And I think in our budget book, if we look at 418, or sorry, 419, you can see in the inter-fund transfers, so line resources 5200, you can see kind of the progression of investments that we've made over time to where the 21-22 approved and adopted budget had a transfer of 2 million. That will continue. That helps pay for maintenance projects on buildings, so HVAC, as well as our synthetic turf field replacements at our high schools. At this point, we do have, I believe, all high schools with synthetic fields. Those do have a defined life cycle of between 10 to 12 years. So this fund helps ensure that those fields are maintained at the quality they need to be and replaced when needed.
And Bob, can I just interrupt for 1 minute? Just from a historical perspective, this transfer into this fund started pre-Christie even. And it came at a time when I think it was in 2008, the district had lots of conversations in the community, and the community said, we want to be sure that you have a way you are funding deferred maintenance, because at the time there had been a lot of deferred maintenance that the district, so that I think that was around 2008. So this is a project that's, we continue to transfer into that so we can keep on top of some of those maintenance projects.
Great, and we have a question, Mr. Silva from Barbara.
Well, I don't know if actually I should ask it now or you can answer it later, but any concerns about health problems because of those type of fields? Was that reviewed and looked into before spending all the money to put down?
The turf fields, again, started pre-Christie. And I think the last turf field was done at McKay, and that was during my time here. And now that we're into synthetic turf fields, there hasn't been any plan to redo those into grass fields. So that would have to be facilities planning and a group of people to come together to make that decision. And I don't know what went into it at the time because it was quite a few years ago.
Would it be possible to possibly get a, since the first turf field came in, maybe get a study of some data of injuries created because of the turf field?
Maybe we can have a report on how we make sure that they remain in safe condition as part of that too. Yeah.
We can follow this up in board leadership as well.
But I appreciate that because I know there's been some weird stuff going on, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Nancy, did you have a question?
I just had a comment. I wanted to further expand on what you said about the deferred maintenance. In the run up to the 2008 bond, it was a very healthy conversation with the community because that 2008 bond was 50% spent on deferred maintenance because we had let so many things go with budget issues. I'd also add that the turf field issue started when West Salem High School was opened, which opened in the fall of 2002. And part of that building was giving them a turf field. And then the rest of the high schools either self-funded those initial projects with donors, or the community helped to do that. So it was, once that decision was made to put it in to West, and that was quite some time ago, it became somewhat of an equity issue.
Thank you. And then our commitment with those turf fields were added was that we would replace from district funds at the time. So we didn't get them to the place where they weren't safe for play. And I appreciate the safety questions.
All right. And I just saw the ASL interpreter out of the corner of my eye, so I'll try to be cognizant of that. So if you hear me talking slow, that's why. All right, page 182 of your budget book is for Fund 421, which is our 2018 Bond Capital Projects Fund. So that was approved by the voters in May 2018. It can only be spent as described in the ballot measure or ballot title, and it's currently being used to renovate and build classrooms, common areas, HVAC, security, seismic, and tech upgrades district-wide. We are in year 4 of that project, and That again is on page 182, and that will exist for several years in the future as we wrap up the bond projects. All right, so now we're moving into section 300 of your budget book, which is our debt service funds. The first fund in there is Fund 307 on page 170. This is our PERS debt service, and that's currently funded. In other words, money is transferred in there by charging 9.5% on our wages. So all of our salary, and I think you saw that in the summary as well, that Christy showed on the assumptions, where the 9.5% is charged on raises. So I don't remember the exact years. I think it was 2002, 2004, and 2015 to cover the unfunded liability of our PERS costs. The district did sell these pension bonds. And this is the debt payment on those bonds to cover our UAL for PERS. And it essentially covers the PERS principal and interest payments, and then also rate changes in PERS throughout the years. The next debt service fund is Fund 308, which is located on page 173. This fund is funded by property taxes levied for the sole purpose of paying the general obligation bonds. And as you can see there, it can only be used to pay principal and interest on the general obligation debt. And I believe that's the end of this. The other debt service we have is transportation debt service. And that was kind of covered up above in the transportation. That's covered internally within the transportation grant package. And maybe Sarah can help me out, because even though we covered it yesterday, I forgot how where that's funded, but that pretty much comes, I believe, out of the general fund to pay the debt service on those full faith and credit obligation bonds that were used for the transportation facility.
It is a little confusing, Bob, so no worries. It's actually in the asset replacement fund. The buses run through asset replacement fund, and so does the debt service associated with all the transportation. And then when we look at the general fund, we see the facility itself. And it's sort of a strange setup to split those, but that was guidance from ODE and proper tracking.
Okay. And we probably, so this for your review, and I don't know if Christy or Alice wants to review this. Our next meeting is April 27th, which will also be a Zoom meeting online. And then our budget committee meeting officially kicks off May 3rd, where the chair and vice chair will be elected and the committee will receive the budget message. And that leaves time for questions if we have any.
Yeah, and for the next meeting, while you're thinking if you have questions, we don't have a specific topic. So if you could generate any questions by Friday, that will be a great way for us to plan for next Wednesday. We felt like kind of those were the big overview topics we wanted to go through prior to the budget message. And so, again, some of the questions were about next year, and we'll cover those once we start the official budget process. The other conversation, there's been a lot of conversation about the expansion of dual language. Next Tuesday night at our work session with the board, we're going to hear from Assistant Superintendent Cobb on both our expansion of dual language plans and our secondary English language development work that we're tackling. And that's going to be really important because I know there's going to be questions that come up in the budget process. So if budget committee members wanted to tune in either in the moment or after the fact and hear that ahead of the budget process, it will give you some good context for how we're planning to expand our dual language programs. And again, that will likely come up in the budget process of where you funding that.
Yes, Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. I just had a couple of just general questions. On the transportation facility, are you guys considering any electric buses in the fleet?
We already have 2 electric buses that we have received grants from. I can't remember if we have a third yet, but we have 2. The first one, it took a little bit to get them up and running. So we do have some electric charging stations, and I'm assuming we'll have 1 or 2 at the new transportation facility. Our goal with the electric buses is to try a few to see how they are and what the cost and efficiencies are before we would expand the fleet. The current transportation proposal, which included new buses, was calculated based on regular buses.
Okay, that sounds like a good plan to me. My next question was, and I can't remember which fund it is, but the equity lens, we have a couple of elementary schools in my area, Inglewood and Richmond, which I think are on the low income level. And I'm wondering if they are on that list for construction and for upgrades to music, playground equipment, stuff like that.
I'm going to ask if you would, well, we don't have quite a plan for that, but that is, there's a little conversation I want to have when we get to the proposed budget for next year. Because we are going to make that more of an equity-based fund. So it's a great question. And that's exactly what we're thinking about. We know that in certain areas of our community, it's much more difficult for parents to fund for music instruments.
Yeah.
We often have PTCs that can do really nice playgrounds. So we're trying to build a strategy so that our schools in areas where parents can't fundraise are up to a similar standard. So thank you. And I'll answer that more in the budget process.
Perfect. Okay. I did have one last question. Going back to Inglewood and Richmond as an example, they have classrooms that have the population to teacher ratio. I think it was 25, 30 kids in kindergarten at one point when my grandson was in there. In the construction, are you guys allocating funds to some of those other schools to help reduce that ratio for students? Or is that in the plan somewhere?
Yeah, so we got to take care of that a couple different ways.
Okay.
One of the things we're seeing is a decrease in enrollment at the elementary level. So elementary in general, the enrollment is decreasing, which means there is more space. The space in the 2018 bond was based on those projections. Our class, the other part of that though, then is teachers. And so the teachers would be funded in the Gen Fund, and the classroom construction would be potentially funded through capital construction. And that was all built into that 2018 bond. Some of those sites don't have a lot of room for expansion.
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't.
I know.
Okay.
That's some of those are some of our oldest, most loved buildings too.
They've got a lot of character. Thank you very much for the answers.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Levy.
Yeah, thank you for the presentations. They were great. One question that I hear come up sometimes in the community is if there's any overlap between the bond funding and the general fund. If any of the work that's going into the construction that's that people generally understand as being bond funded, that if it ends up overlapping into the general fund. So I wonder if that's something that can be, if you can address that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of some of the exact questions that have come up so I can answer it most specifically. The capital constructions and the bond funds can only be used for capital construction and bond work. We do have employees that are paid for out of that, but they have to have a direct connection to the bond project. So we have project managers, we have budget analysts. So we have positions and funded in there that aren't in the gen fund. And the only the places that it begins to overlap, and a good example is the transportation facility, which isn't a bond, that's full faith and credit. But if the transportation facility was funded out of a bond, the place you would see is when there's personnel in the gen fund to run the new transportation facility, or when we open CTEC, there's funds for people out of the gen fund. So teaching and learning and people to do teaching and learning, gen fund. Construction, promises to the voter, outside the gen fund. Did that answer it, Levy?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
And one last, hopefully quick question. I remember before the pandemic hit, there was, I don't remember exactly what year, but there was a special fund set aside that would be available for teachers to, or to distribute extra funding for schools, like for materials or activities, trying to bring more equity to, you know, some of our educators are having to spend money out of their budget, out of their personal budget, you know, and so I remember it came up around the choir conversations and how we had some choirs that, you know, had the funding to provide like really good equipments and uniforms and all that, and other schools that didn't. So I remember it was around that time. It was a couple years ago, but it just something that was in the conversation brought it up to me. So I was wondering if there's if there's anything like that in this current year.
Yeah, we are doing a lot of that out of SIA around that engagement strategy right now. When we come to you with a new budget, we have some ideas around a slightly different strategy around that. So the teacher supply one, not as clearly, but I'm trying to rewind back to which budget that was and to think about if we did something that I'm just not remembering. So I'm gonna think on that one a little bit and maybe go back to a couple of those other previous budgets.
Thank you. And I just want to remind everybody, we have about 5 more minutes with the hard stop at 12:45, and we see 2 more hands up. So get 2 questions going or 1 question. So, Director Chandigarh, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, quick question. Superintendent Perry and Chair Avila, thank you very much. A quick question is, will there be some dedicated fund set aside to purchase different language books and high quality instructional materials, where like in Spanish language, which we can proportionately have in our libraries and teachers can use it in such a way that it is an open source curriculum, or that families can access it, and buying license for the families or children, so that, because last year we had teachers literally translating the educational material when we had to go hybrid. So and increasing the proportion of library books in Spanish language in different schools, where parents can take it home and read and help with the children.
So you're asking a question about a future budget, not this budget.
Yes. No, future budget.
Okay.
Will there be some dedicated funding for that? Or part of the Title I can be used to even teach parents, like adult education, with the books for their parents can read and help in the homework at home.
Yeah, so just 2 comments related to this year's budget. One, yes, title funds are often used for those things. We also have budget done in our library media budget, and we have a portion of our material selection around diverse texts. And so that guides our selection process. And also title funding is often used for parent training. So we have a lot of parent activity nights and training that we're loving to get back to those now that we don't have as many of the restrictions. So all great questions.
And Nancy, go ahead.
Mine is really just a comment. When we were in the buildup to the 2018 bond, our ability to decrease class size was limited by classroom availability. And it's really hard for me to see that we're in a place where we've added classrooms and now we're going to be limited by the availability of teachers, and that's just the reality we're in right now. Just makes me sad.
Yeah, and I think it might have been you, Laura, that asked the question about, are we worried about staffing? And that is an absolute worry, and you're seeing it everywhere. I sat with somebody at Easter who was telling me that in a high school in Bend, her son was the principal, she's like, are you dying with shortages? So every place is struggling with the staffing shortages, and it's not just education, right? We see it everywhere we go, but how that plays out in the budget process is that we will budget for what we want to get to for staffing. If we can't fill the staffing, then that's vacancies, which means then there's places in the budget where we don't spend, and all those come to you as an ending fund balance, which in the next budget cycle becomes the beginning fund balance. So if we can't fill positions, we'll budget to what we believe we need, and if we can't fill them, then there are vacancies in the budget.
Thank you, everybody. Christy, can I offer that if there's questions that budget committee members have or other directors, to send them to you by this Friday?
Yeah, if they send them to Amanda by Friday, that would be awesome. And then that'll really help us plan for what we do next Wednesday. We haven't hit at the topic of social emotional learning and how that's funded. We could do that next week. So if you have some ideas, not about a question, but a topic you'd like to hear more about, we'd be happy to consider those as well.
Thank you. It is 12:45. I will call this special board meeting adjourned. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good to see everyone. Thank you.
Adios.